Welcome to C Files, folks. Thanks for joining me. Um, we're going to be in The Battle for Christmas, Stefan Nissenbaum. And if I remember right, this is reading number 30. And we're getting into a section that I'm really going to enjoy. This is a cultural history of America's most cherished holiday, and that is Christmas. It's a Pulitzer Prize finalist. So it's just basically the history of Christmas in America. But in this reading, beginning on page 222, we're going to take a trip across the ocean, the Atlantic, to England. I know today it's called the United Kingdom, but back then it was called England. Back then, when? Well, I'm going to be reading about Ebenezer Scrooge and the Cratchits, a Christmas story. And this is a little bit of the history of it. And have you ever heard the backstory to that classic by Charles Dickens? Well, we're about to hear it now. There's a very famous fictional family of the mid-19th century, and a British family at that, which resembles that of Brace's real-life shoemaker. It is the Cratchit family, the central household in Charles Dickens' classic 1843 novel, A Christmas Carol. Too poor to provide adequate medical care for their children, the youngest of whom, Tiny Tim, is for that reason a cripple. The Cratchits are intensely genial, close-knit, and nurturing. Everything that Bob Cratchit's employer, Ebenezer Scrooge, is not for Dickens, as for Brace. The social warmth of the Cratchit family achieves its apotheosis at Christmas. Despite their poverty, the Cratchits have a merry time of it, and their merriment is a celebration of domesticity itself. What Brace wrote of German families at Christmas makes for an apt summary of the scene Dickens paints. The Cratchits' joy has nothing to do with a duty to be cheerful. Rather, they are cheerful because they cannot help it, and because they all love one another. They are happy because they have been making one another happy. There is another characteristic of what Brace considered to be German culture that applies to the Cratchits. They are polite and well-mannered to their superiors, even in the face of incessant provocation. In their case, provocation by Ebenezer Scrooge. It is impossible to imagine their case. I'm sorry, it is impossible to imagine Bob Cratchit snarling at Scrooge. How in the world shall I know? And I'm cleaned it up. And he, how in, how the H dash LL shall I know is how it's written in the book. Even in private, at the family's Christmas dinner, Bob Cratchit refuses to say a mean word about his employer. To be sure, the Cratchits are fictional creations. But as social types, even though they are surely exaggerated, they are not altogether unreal. To begin with, they are not really members of the British working class. Every bit is, let me get this light on here a little bit better. There we go. Every bit as much as Brace's shoemaker, they are integrated into the larger society. The shoemaker was an independent artisan, and he lived in a respectable neighborhood in the same boarding house as Brace himself. The actual working class of mid-19th century Britain and America were composed chiefly of industrial laborers, men and women who worked in textile mills or coal mines. But Ebenezer Scrooge was apparently not an industrial capitalist, but rather a merchant. We learn almost nothing about the nature of Scrooge's line of work except that he owns a warehouse. Nor was there Bob, nor was Bob Cratchit an industrial laborer. He was a clerk. He worked not on an assembly line, but in an office of his own, however ill-heated it may have been in the winter. Indeed, as far as we can tell, Cratchit was Scrooge's only employee, and a trusted one at that. In modern parlance, he was, albeit barely, a white-collar worker, more like a bank teller than a coal miner or a mill operative. However, badly Cratchit was treated by Scrooge, he was not apt to be laid off in hard times, as many industrial workers would have been. And however badly Scrooge treated Cratchit, the two men maintained a close working relationship. Cratchit's office was located right next to Scrooge's. Again, this stands in sharp contrast to the conditions of most industrial workers whose employers would not even have been able to identify them by either name or face. Cratchit is literate. Let me read it this way. Cratchit is literate, too. Indeed, that is one of the requirements of his job. And so is at least one of his sons. One reason for the literacy may be that Cratchit's wife and their children all stay at home, unlike their counterparts in most working class families of the time. They do not labor for wages to help support the family. The Cratchit exhibits none of the behavior that respectable people of the time associate with working class culture. He does not drink to excess. He does not spend all his wages on payday. He is not what most assume sexually promiscuous. In modern parlance, he is the head of a stable, child-centered family. All this is not to deny that Bob Cratchit is an exploited worker, but only to observe that he is hardly a realistic symbol of the industrial uh, proletariat. It would be more accurate to identify him in 19th century terms as a man who is struggling to become part of the respectable and respectful petite bourgeoisie. A Christmas Carol is often read today, and it is often read in the 19th century, as if it painted a vivid picture of alienated class relations in the period of the Industrial Revolution, and as if it evoked ways of bridging the vast gulf that had emerged between the top and bottom strata of society through the kind of fellow feeling that Ebenezer Scrooge comes to experience after his conversion. But that is not the case. The vast and depressing face of the Industrial Revolution scarcely appears in this book. The poor themselves never make any demands of Scrooge, and for that matter, he never encounters them. We never see him approached by a beggar, for example. In fact, the only contact Scrooge has with the poor is in his vision, a dream, as it turns out, that unfolds in the safety of his own bed. And even in that dream, none of the poor ever curse or threaten him. The most horrible vision Scrooge has, a vision evoked by the ghost of Christmas future, is the indifference expressed by his business acquaintances when they learn of his death. In other books, Dickens addressed other kinds of social relationships, the gap between bourgeois and proletarian in hard times. I apologize, folks. I have a hard time pronouncing certain words because of a birth defect that I have. This side of my lip is missing a nerve. It affects my tongue from birth, and so I've always had difficulty with that from time to time. So please bear with me. I appreciate it. All right. Let's see where we were. The words I had difficulties. I know, of course, when you look at Bourdieu and proletarian, of course, that's words that came out of the also words that were used, I should say, during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, uh, terming the different classes against each other. The proletariat, the poorer class, working class, the bourgeois, uh, the upper or rich class, if you will, and of course that they were pitted against each other. You can see the dynamic behind that when you're looking at what's being said in this book, and when you're looking at A Christmas Carol, you see that divide, that gap. There's really no middle class being depicted there. So let me go back to where we were. In other words, Dickens addressed other kinds of social relationships, the gap between bourgeois and proletarian in hard times. For example, or the inadequacy of the industrialized charity of Oliver Twist. What A Christmas Carol deals with in a practical way is something less vast in its own way, equally troubling. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens addressed not the great social divisions among classes estranged from one another by wealth, distance, and occupation, but the daily, intimate class differences among people who were much closer to one another on the social side. But if Bob Cratchit is not a member, if the industrial working class, neither is I'm sorry, I'm reading it the way it's written, folks. So I'm just going to read the way it's written. Uh, but if Bob Cratchit is not a member, I think it's a misprint. I'll read it the way I think it was meant to be put down. For if Bob Cratchit is not a member of the industrial working class, neither was Ebenezer Scrooge, an upper class industrial capitalist. This is true in a purely economic sense, since Scrooge seems to be a merchant and not an industrialist. And it is also true in the behavioral sense. In terms of his own lowly origins, he began as an apprentice to old Fezziwig. And also his adult behavior. Scrooge, too, is essentially a member of the petite bourgeois, a self-made man who has spent his life striving hard and at the cost of all human relationships, whether public or private, to attain a sense of security. He is a man who has not managed to grasp the point that such mighty striving is no longer required of him. No matter how wealthy he may be, Scrooge is not really a rich man. It might be more accurate to describe him as a poor man who has a lot of money. That is until the end of the book. Whatever else Scrooge's conversion represents, it also marks his realization that he has made it after all, that he can finally afford to ease up on himself and others. Considered sociologically, Scrooge's conversion may mark his entry into the easy culture of the upper middle class world, a world for which he has previously been eligible only in an economic sense, but which his temperament has heretofore barred him from joining. In the more contemporaneous language of Charles Loring Brace, Scrooge is finally ready to transform the emotionally hollow culture of sheer greed into a more fulfilling culture in which everyday activities and relationships are softened by family values. From both perspectives, one of the signs of Scrooge's social rise is that he finally accepts his obligation to treat his clerk, Cratchit, in a more humane fashion. That obligation, however, has its limits, even at Christmas. For when, at the very end of the book, Scrooge signifies to the Cratchits that he has changed, he does so by giving them a Christmas turkey, the largest bird he can find. But he has the turkey sent to the Cratchits. He does not deliver it in person, despite what several of the movie versions of A Christmas Carol may suggest. Presents, yes, but not presents. Scrooge is the founder of the feast. He does not participate in the Cratchits' actual Christmas dinner. Instead, he chooses to take dinner with his own family at the house of his nephew, Fred. The message was clear. It was enough to provide such known employees with a gift. And while this is surely not the point of the book, it is, of course, evident that even the gift amounts to good business practice. For henceforth, Scrooge will surely be able to count on Bob Cratchit's heightened loyalty and diligence. Cratchit will become an even better employee. In other words, A Christmas Carol addressed the relationship of the well-to-do, not with the faceless poor, but with the poor who were personally known and whose predicament might provoke pangs of conscience. It offered a perspective on how to deal with people who neither belonged to one's own family or social circle, nor were members of the anonymous proletariat. This was a real problem in society where Christmas rituals were becoming domesticated and class differences themselves were being reshaped. Scrooge was not a country squire. Cratchit was not his tenant or apprentice. Maybe, had either been the case, each would have known just what to do at Christmas. And of course, there would have been no story. But the creation in England and America of vast armies of middle class people and wage earners produced a new type of society in which the old rituals of inversion and misrule no longer made much sense. Indeed, the relationship between the youthful Scrooge and his master, old Fezziwig, had been a paternalist one, a relationship of patron and client. Scrooge was Fezziwig's apprentice, not his employee. Indeed, Fezziwig held an old-time Christmas, too, attended by an array of his dependents. But as Dickens himself well knew, that was an earlier age in a pre-capitalist culture. Cratchit could never have been Scrooge's apprentice. The economic system had changed, and with it, the social relationships between patron and client. In a still later age, employers might recreate old Fezziwig's Christmas in the form of an office party, but the employees' families would not participate in that. The fact that Scrooge did not share a meal with the Cratchits makes the point. The rituals were changing. What Dickens showed his readers was how to navigate the ritual waters of the Christmas season so as to avoid the dual shoals of the guilt, and that might stem from not giving it at all across. Let me try it again. What Dickens showed his readers was how to navigate the ritual waters of the Christmas season so as to avoid the dual shoals of the guilt that might stem from not giving it all across class lines and the messiness, not to say futility, that would result from giving to every beggar who walked the streets or knocked on one's door. Still, and for all that, there is something elusive about A Christmas Carol. Its message has proven malleable, subject to different readings. During the century and a half since its publication in 1843, progressive liberals have claimed this book is a plea to ameliorate the evils of industrial capitalism. The free enterprise conservatives have been equally able to claim it for their own. Thus, the New York Times in 1893, in the depths of a very severe depression, used A Christmas Carol to make the point that private charitable resources were sufficient to relieve pressing want, and the commitment of the city's most wealthy citizens to do so was strong. At no time in the history of the city has private helpfulness come more eagerly or more prodigally to the reinforcement of good public deeds. Philanthropically, try it again, philanthropically minded employees had plunged into the fray with all the noble ardor of all the benevolent philanthropists ever fabled by Charles Dickens, performing prodigies of kindness, reminiscent of a recreated and rejuvenated Scrooge. For the Times, the message was clear. Who shall dare to say hereafter that corporations have no souls? That editorial was based on a plausible reading of A Christmas Carol, but it was equally plausible to read the book as an attack on capitalism. The elusiveness of A Christmas Carol may, in part, be what has allowed it to become an enduring literary classic, or actually more than a classic, for this book has entered a legendary realm beyond the category of literature itself. The name Scrooge has entered the language as a generic descriptive, and his story has become part of the common lore of the English-speaking world. Now, the economic explanations here are really fascinating to me. To me, to take personal responsibility to assist an individual is the how can we say it? It's the best way to represent Christ. The corporate giving to me is impersonal, cold in a sense. I gave my money, therefore I'm a good boy, right? I'm a good person because I gave money to a charity. It's a way of it's almost like checking off a box. It's very impersonal, kind of cold. I gave money, the charity will do the work for me. I don't have to get my hands dirty, actually getting down uh, into the dirt, if you will, as a metaphor, to help another person. I'm basically hiring someone else to do that for me. Um, that doesn't really appeal to me as just personally. I've helped people. I've helped people in the past who needed help. I didn't refer them to some charity or agency. If I had the ability to help them, I took care of it myself. And so this lesson of A Christmas Carol is very, very instructive. It's very interesting to me. And the relationships involved there. He never helped strangers except through the hiring of someone else, in a sense of the word, to help them, giving to the charity to help them, but never got his hands dirty. Especially the scene of where they were in almost like a tunnel with the fire, and they're homeless, and the husband's trying to take care of his family. You don't see Scrooge enter that. That's what the charity is for. All right. I'm at 25 minutes. I will not have enough time to finish this next section. I'll come to it in the next reading. Well, maybe, yeah, I won't be able to do it. On the evils of indiscriminate giving. Man, I really kind of want to continue. You know what? Let's give it a shot. See if I can get through this in 10 to 15 minutes. A Christmas Carol A Christmas Carol does deal briefly with larger questions of wealth and poverty, first at the very beginning of the book, and once again at the very end. Scrooge is approached at the start by a pair of men who visit his office to solicit a cash donation to help the destitute. These men represent an unnamed charitable organization, and their own society, I'm sorry, in their own social status is clear. They are gentlemen, meaning they are of a class above that to which Scrooge himself belongs. Scrooge, of course, turns these gentlemen down in a famous exchange in which he retorts that there are prisons and workhouses to house the destitute, and that his paying taxes to support these. Then, at the end of the book, after his conversion, Scrooge sees these same two gentlemen on the street, and he approaches them and proceeds to offer the contribution he had earlier refused. We never learn how large a contribution, since Scrooge whispers the sum in their ear. All we know is that the charitable gentlemen are delighted. In that sense, Scrooge's conversion also has to do with his new ability to make a distinction between the different kinds of Christmas obligations he owes to different kinds of people. To members of his family, he owes face to face participation. And as we have seen, to the known poor with whom he deals regularly, he must send a present. But his debt to the unknown poor, the faceless, suffering poor of industrial society, can be paid at a larger distance by offering a donation to a private charitable organization, and the agency itself will provide the poor with meat and drink and means of warmth. Scrooge's conversion entails his ability to create a new categorical distinction. If the reborn Scrooge were approached by a beggar on the street or at his door, he could now respond with a clear conscience by saying, in effect, I gave at the office. And this is the point that I have been making before I even read this section. By the 1840s, Christmas giving was beginning to be polarized into just those two different activities. Gifts for one's own family and friends now took the form of presents, while gifts that were given to the needy took the form of charity. There were important differences between the two. The gifts given to family and friends consisted of luxury items, ordinarily purchased by the givers and presented directly to their recipients, either face to face or accompanied by a personal note. The gifts given to the faceless poor consisted mostly of necessities, which were ordinarily purchased and distributed not by the givers, but by a charitable organization which mediated between the other parties and eliminated the need for any direct contact between donor and recipient. It's very clean and clinical, isn't it? You don't have to become emotionally involved. Um, and there's nothing wrong with using an organization to give to the poor like that and help the poor. I'm all for that. I just think it's almost a clinical way of doing it. Um, when you actually personally help someone, it's a completely and totally different dynamic. I had not always been I'm sorry, I misread. Do it again. It had not always been that way. Before the era of the domestic and commercial Christmas, in the 19th century, as we have seen, presents and charity were one and the same, and they were given to the same people directly and face to face. Indeed, on a small scale, such rituals persisted well into the 19th century and beyond. For example, in 1837, the Lenox, Massachusetts branch of the Sedgwick family held just such an event. It was centered, interestingly enough, around a Christmas tree. The first such tree that any member of the Sedgwick family had ever erected. Joining the children around this tree in the parlor of Charles Sedgwick's house was a group of the family's local dependents who had been collected. The word used by Susan Ridley Sedgwick, Charles's sister-in-law, who described the scene in a private letter to her husband. Among the dependents, Susan Sedgwick reported, were several of Charles's poor prisoners. I'm sorry, pensioners. There were several of Charles's poor pensioners, several blacks, and among others, the deaf and dumb lad, whom you may remember to have applied for, to get him in at Hartford, a school for the deaf and dumb. The lad looked perfectly delighted, Susan Sedgwick noted, and she went on to report with pride that little black girl named Josie, a crippled child, apparently, joined in dancing around the Christmas tree, turning round and round, now assisted by one and now by another of the children, all fear of amalgamation, i.e., race mixing, entirely forgotten. It was really quite affecting to witness. Susan Sedgwick insisted, so much happiness, so diffused, and yet created from such simple materials. But that kind of ritual was becoming increasingly difficult to carry off. Lenox, Massachusetts represented a mystical pocket of ritual paternalism, a self-conscious pocket at that, and the Sedgwicks were both willing and able to play the role of gracious squires to their poor pensioners. In the urban areas of the nation, especially, such gestures were much more difficult to bring off. The urban poor were now living in separate neighborhoods, and except for domestics and menials, they had little occasion for personal contact with the well-to-do. And when such contacts did take place, especially at Christmas, they were likely to take an awkward or even hostile form mixed perhaps with a bit of mockery and a whole exchange lubricated with alcohol. Still, the distinction between presents and charity was new, and it should not be surprising that it required a good deal of reinforcement. During the middle decades of the 19th century, the press, the economic elite, and even those who were most deeply concerned with helping the poor, all pressed the notion that organized charities provided the most appropriate means of assisting the poor. Horace Greeley, for example, reminded his New York Tribune readers in 1843 that enough was expended on this festival uselessly, which would, if rightfully appropriated, have set in operation a means of ultimately banishing pauperism and its attendant miseries from the land. Rightfully appropriated was the operative phrase here. Money should be money should be offered to the poor through organized charities rather than through what was now being universally attacked as a dismissive phrase, indiscriminate giving. Greeley was especially critical of what had become the dominant form of face-to-face charity, begging on the streets. One Tribune Christmas editorial opened with the blunt heading, "Do not give to street beggars," and went on to dismiss the practice in no uncertain terms. Whenever you see one of these city pests approaching, button up both pockets. It's interesting because I am seeing the same dynamic today. Um, there are beggars in the larger cities on the streets, the homeless in America. I was a police officer in one of those cities. I saw a lot of homeless begging on the streets. And I saw some people gave to them and helped them, and some did not. And there was really kind of a debate going on if you should give to them or not give to them. And if does giving to them enable their behavior? Is it a codependent act to give to them personally, that type of thing? And does it help the situation? It's a similar discussion that's happening today. It's interesting that over 100 years ago, the same discussion was being had in America and in England. Another editorial, this one from a Depression year, explained that the evil of street begging would inevitably increase as a result of the hardness of the times. Imposters will abound more than ever in it, for example. And the same thing's being said today. And there are imposters, by the way. There are scam artists that pretend to be homeless and beg on the street, and some of them have made some really good money. But buttoning up one's pockets was psychologically difficult. He who rejects a petition for the needs of a night's lodging or a meal may have his own warm rest distributed by the reasonable apprehension that fearful exposure and distress have resulted from his prudence. On this occasion, the Tribune handed out meal tickets instead of cash to beggars, but making contributions to organized charity offered a more effective solution. It would obviate the need for face-to-face encounters along with the danger of fraud, and it would be far more efficient. The Tribune pleaded with its readers to send their donations to one of the charitable organizations because that way of helping the poor might not be perfect, but it is more effectual and humane than any other yet adopted. And yet today, now in my time, your time, we're finding that some of these organizations are not on the up and up in themselves. So, or as the same paper put it in still another Christmas editorial, let us give not merely as cases of destitution, may present themselves, but through the regularly organized channels for the dispensation of social charity, wherewith our own and most other cities are blessed. If the middle class press criticized indiscriminate giving, it also generally attacked another alternative to private charities, governmental support for the poor through programs of public assistance or public works. Many working men themselves call for just such programs, especially during years of severe depression. The kind of devastating depression that regularly shook the new capitalist economy. When the times were hard, many employers simply laid their workers off, and there was no unemployment insurance to see them through. In one Depression year, 1854, a large group of unemployed New York workers held a meeting on Christmas Day, forming themselves as the Merchants and Working Man's Aid Association. The assembled workers passed a resolution that demanded that tenants shall not be turned out of their homes by avaricious landlords and called for what amounted to a rent strike by appointing a vigilante committee to oversee the response. The city had made a special $10,000 appropriation for the poor, and the workers demanded that some of those funds be given directly to the association itself. One speaker denounced the municipal soup kitchens as haughty and contemptuous, and added that they served watery soup. Another speaker called for public works programs instead of soup kitchens. A third demanded that the city itself subsidize up to 50% of rent payments for the unemployed. The newly established New York Times responded to the situation by acknowledging that these were hard times and expressing special sympathy for the fact that men are poor this winter who were never poor before. This was as much as to say that such men were more worthy of sympathy than those who had always been poor. In passing, the Times even proposed paternalist gestures on the part of those employers who could afford it, retaining their workmen, though they are not profitable. But the editorial reserved the bulk of its space to stress the superiority of giving through such established institutions as the churches and the newly formed Children's Aid Society. This was presented in the name of simple efficacy. Money contributed to such organizations will find where the misery is. Such institutions have well established channels and employ effectual and discriminating techniques. They have at their disposal well-tooled machinery to make sure that each individual dollar reaches tomorrow the very family that is famishing today for lack of it. Implicitly, the paper argued that any contribution not mediated by those organizations was nothing but a form of indiscriminate giving. If a man has money and does not know how he can make the most of it, let him step into the offices of any of those excellent institutions in whose hands, if you place a dollar, you do what individually could not make $5 do. A decade later, the same newspaper actually argued that this kind of charity was little more than a continuation of the long-standing tradition of Christmas generosity on the part of the British gentry and nobility. In the previous century, the argument went, no hungry faces were allowed to be seen around the Baron's Hall, or the monk's open doors, or the citizen's gate. That tradition was being maintained into the present with hardly a hitch. Modern times have continued this pleasant custom of benefaction. Try it again. Modern times have continued this pleasant custom of benefaction. Yesterday, we doubt not, the faces of thousands of the poor were made happy with the good fare provided by the generosity of the charitable, the bounty of others, heaped the tables of the outcast with good things. But in fact, it was only to the work of charitable institutions that the paper was referring to the missions, the industrial schools, the lodging houses for homeless boys and girls, and the almshouses and asylums and refuges. And the editorial concluded by giving its readers the now standard advice. Those good-hearted individuals who fear to do as much injury as good by their indiscriminate charities should seek out the great public almoners, our benevolent societies, who have reduced charity almost to a science and probably seldom err on the side of too much generosity. As matters grew worse during the following decades, and workers responded by attempting to unionize, the press became even more insistent that private benevolence was far superior to either indiscriminate giving or public assistance. At Christmas in 1893, several local unions were out on strike, but the New York Times responded with a warning that it acknowledged might seem strange to its readers. Strange as it may sound, there is danger of overdoing the charitable relief business, or at least of misdoing it, if it is not put under concentrated, intelligent, and judicious direction. But there is need of great discretion in organizing and directing agencies for the relief of the poor in times like these. More than ever is it important that this work should be done intelligently and judiciously. Lavish and indiscriminate giving to applicants, however vouched for, will result in waste. Worst of all, it will encourage and embolden beggary and attract worthless vagrants from all quarters. The editorial decried the use of public monies to ease the situation, insisting that organized arrangements for distributing this superfluity among the needy through private benevolence are much better than efforts to use public authority and public funds for the relief of the poor or the unemployed. What the editorial did not mention, though it would have been clear to any reader who also followed the labor columns of the same paper, was that not one of the established charitable organizations was willing to provide assistance to workers who were out on strike. When we come back, we'll be on page 231, Charles Loring Brace, Newsboys and the Children's Aid Society. What a fascinating discussion in this book on charity out of Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol. It's interesting how the the debates and discussions that were happening back then are very similar to the debates and discussions that are still happening today when it comes to trying to help the poor. If you think of the Great Society under President Lyndon Johnson and the debate over that, whether it was helpful or not helpful, whether it was harmful or not. Debates concerning organized charities. Are they trustworthy? How much money do they spend on themselves versus the people they're supposed to be helping? And then the debate on whether you should give to individuals or not as an individual. These are still debates we're having today, and apparently we have not resolved that issue. So, what a fascinating read there. Thank you for watching, and I will be back for more, or with more, I should say. And we'll see you back here on the C Files. God bless. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And I hope this has been a blessing to you.